Alright, in this video we're just going to look at some difficult questions, generally 4-mark questions that ask you how to answer questions regarding the price mechanism, competitive markets and relative prices and how they influence resource allocation. So question 1, explain how resources are allocated in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, 4 marks. How do I go about this question? I like to use what we call the Dole approach. This is an approach advocated by other more experienced economics teachers about how to go about answering these questions. So firstly, define a competitive market. Define what that means, define the key features of a competitive market. Secondly, outline how the price mechanism and relative prices determine how resources are going to be allocated. Okay, so how does the price mechanism work? Third, link how the price mechanism actually works. So how do price signals send signals to suppliers to supply certain goods and services? And lastly, use an example. Use an example to explain your answer. So here's a way to go about it. A perfectly competitive market assumes the absence of government regulations and where resources, land, labour, capital and entrepreneurship are free to move around the economy via changes to demand and supply and relative prices. So when you're defining a perfectly competitive market, you say that it's got no government regulations and that resources, and define what resources are, move around based on demand and supply. Okay? It is changes in relative prices that determine how resources are being used among competing uses. When demand or supply changes in markets, it results in a change in relative prices of various goods and services, which sends signals to economic agents and cause a shift in resource allocation. Key terms. Okay? Define a competitive market. No government intervention. What does it mean, a competitive market? Well, resources are free to move around based on demand and supply. Relative prices determine where resources are allocated, because that sends signals to producers about where they're going to shift their scarce resources. So the first 2 marks is all about explaining what's meant by a perfectly competitive market and how the price mechanism works. Then your second 2 marks provide an example. So for an example, and this is just using a random example, in my next video I'll show you some current examples you can use, but these are just some random ones that you can use that are very generic. For example, an increase in the demand for diamonds will result in a higher price of diamonds relative to other commodities or products. The higher relative price will encourage producers or entrepreneurs or workers to allocate more resources to the production, to the production of diamonds. Okay. The key thing in getting full marks is actually explaining how the resources change from one industry to the next. That's going to be the difference between a 3 and a 4 mark answer. So how do resources shift into diamond production? Well, what happens? Existing diamond producers will expand their operations, and other mining businesses might expand into diamond exploration. So other industries that might have been mining opals or gemstones will shift into diamond industry. Okay, labour is going to shift into the diamond industry. More people will want to work in that industry. In this way, resources are allocated from one sector to another as a result of change in relative prices. So use an example, and you can use any example. You could use apples and oranges and use exactly the same thing. Okay, apples get a higher demand, that leads to a higher relative price. This will encourage producers to allocate more resources to apple production. So that will mean that farmers are trying to expand their use of land to produce apples. Existing orange plantations may be shifted into apple plantations. More pickers are going to go and want to work in the apple industry. Using any example doesn't matter, you just need to show how land, labour and capital resources shift from one industry to the other. Question 2. With reference to the role of the price mechanism, describe how resources are allocated in a perfectly competitive market. A very similar question, but in this case you need to define what's meant by the price mechanism. So 1 mark. The price mechanism refers to the manner in which changes in relative prices determine how a nation's resources, define what the resources are used among competing uses. When demand or supply changes in markets, it results in a change in relative price. This sends signals to economic agents which ultimately determine what is produced in the economy, or the way resources are used in the economy. Okay? Defining the price mechanism, explaining how it works. 2 marks. What are your second 2 marks going to be for? For an example. For example, an increase in demand for gold relative to other commodities. Basically the same thing. The higher relative price will encourage producers, workers, entrepreneurs to allocate more resources to the mining of gold. Existing gold miners expand their operations. Other mining businesses might expand into gold. In this way, resources are reallocated from one sector to another as a result of a change in relative prices. You're showing how resources are being reallocated. Okay, you might also use the carbon tax and how that raises production costs for businesses. And that leads to lower relative profits. Okay, and therefore we shift resources into cleaner energy. Last question. Explain how a change in relative prices will result in a reallocation of resources. This was in the 2010 exam and only got 43%. Very poorly answered, so 1.8 out of 4 or something. In this question, the first thing you want to do is define what relative prices are and how they shift resource allocation. So define relative prices. Outline how the price mechanism works, so how resources shift based on changes in relative prices. And then use an example. Okay, here's the complete answer. Relative price is the price of one good or service compared to another. Higher relative price sends signals to producers and consumers which affect their incentives and choices. An increase in the relative price of one good to another will generally encourage producers to reallocate resources to that good that is more profitable if the higher relative price is caused by an increase in demand. Okay, if it's caused by an increase in supply, then it's different. So you define relative prices, you've explained how relative prices provide incentives to producers to shift resources, then you use an example. For example, an increase in the relative price of strawberries without an increase in the corresponding price of raspberries may encourage farmers to reallocate resources, land, labour, capital, explain what resources are, towards the production of strawberries, as using resources in this way will yield more profit. The relative price of factors of production may also affect the concentration of resources used by a firm. You wouldn't need this part in your answer, but if, for example, large wage rises are granted, the relative price of labour may increase when measured against the price of capital. This may encourage firms to reduce their employment of labour in the production process and increase the use of capital. So you can talk about relative prices, how they influence how to produce, as well as for whom to produce, as well as what to produce. So that is 3 different types of answers and how to go about answering them.